Welcome, welcome for those of you joining us. We are going to start in about a minute. All right, so it is noon Eastern, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I am Dr. Brianna Beaupre. You can call me Bree. I'm your stream host for today on Stream 1. I'm an assistant professor at Wichita State and also a board member of CrimCon. So we are super excited to have our very first virtual conference. I've been pleasantly surprised. Technology has been working, but also just that these panels and these presentations have been amazing so far. So this has been really awesome. And so just a few things to keep in mind. We'll be proceeding in the order of the program. Each presenter will have 10 minutes. And so that is exactly 10 minutes. For those of you who just came, the panelists, I'll give you a heads up when you have a minute left in the chat. And then I'll let you know when time's up in the chat. And please wrap it up when I let you know time's up. And then for those of you attendees, please type your questions in the Q&A box. And this should look like this for attendees. So you'll want to access your Q&A box here. And just remember to have fun. CrimCon was created to be something different and something accessible. So we are super excited to have you all here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist in this panel titled Rape Myths and Sexual Assault Proclivity.
All right, let me just go ahead and share my screen here. So hopefully everybody can both hear me and see my screen. If you cannot, just unmute yourselves and shout it out. Thank you so much for the thumbs up. I really appreciate that. It makes me feel like I'm not just talking to myself here. So I'm gonna jump on in and thank all of you so much for coming today. I know everybody's busy, so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Today, I'm going to be presenting on a study entitled A Longitudinal Study of Interest in Membership in a Fraternity, Rape Myth Acceptance, and Proclivity to Perpetrate Sexual Assault. My name is Julia O'Connor. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida, and I'm in the School of Social Work, and I'm part of the Violence Against Women faculty cluster here as well. And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors who couldn't be here today, Drs. Rita Seabrook and Sarah McMahon. So I'm going to start off with like the quickest literature review ever, in part because I'm preaching probably to the choir and also given the time limits, but I will talk very briefly about rape myths and rape proclivity and the relationship to fraternity members. So in general, in terms of fraternities, research shows us that members of fraternities are more likely to perpetrate sexual violence and additionally have greater acceptance of attitudes associated with sexual aggression, including rape myths and rape proclivity. And this is compared to men who are not in fraternities. And this body of research led us to a research question that was guiding this paper. Do fraternity members lead to increases? Does fraternity membership lead to increases in sexual violence, or are sexually violent men just more likely to join fraternities? And today I'm going to be talking about, as the title of this panel suggests, attitudes and intentions related to sexual violence, namely rape myth acceptance and proclivity to perpetrate, also called rape proclivity. So first off, rape myths are commonly held ideas that excuse male perpetration and instead place blame on female sexual assault survivors. So for an example, there is the idea that women who dress a certain way is asking to be raped. That's an example of a rape myth. And these types of beliefs are associated with perpetration. So those who endorse these types of beliefs are more likely to perpetrate sexual violence. The second attitude that I'm going to talk about is called rape proclivity, and that's the likelihood of committing sexual violence under certain conditions. For example, so if participants are told they would not be caught. These beliefs are associated with rape myth acceptance and also with actual perpetration of sexual violence. For example, one study found that men who had endorsed a proclivity to perpetrate then went on and at a later time point perpetrated actual sexual violence. So that's actually it for the literature review, fast and furious, I know, but now I'll move on to the methods for this study. So for the procedures, participants were recruited at new student orientations for incoming first-year students at a large public university in the Mid-Atlantic. They were surveyed at 5 time points. And the sample used in this study was 315 men, and it included men who joined a fraternity over the first year, men who were interested in joining a fraternity but did not for some reason, and men who were not interested in joining a fraternity and therefore they did not join a fraternity. For my measures, I used a modified version of the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale, and an example item from that scale reads, quote, if a girl goes into a room alone with a guy at a party, it is her own fault if she is raped. Additionally, I used 2 items to measure rape proclivity, and one of these items reads, how likely would you be to force another person to do something sexual, even if she didn't want to, if you were assured no one could find out and you could not be punished. For the analysis, we use mixed method regression models to understand the relationship between interest and membership in a fraternity and the outcome variables of rape myth acceptance and rape proclivity among first-year college men. So now I'll turn to the good stuff, the results, and go over some of the results. So I'm going to be going over this graph here for the next couple slides. So I'd just like to orient you to the graph along the bottom here. These first 5 bars, you have the 5 subscales of the rape myth scale. So she asked for it, it was not rape, he did not mean to due to intoxication, et cetera, et cetera. These last 2 bars are those that are measuring rape proclivity. There's 2 types of rape proclivity by force or by intoxication. The higher the bar, the worse score. So the more rape myths or rape proclivity was endorsed by the participants. And the black bars here are men who joined fraternities over the first year. The middle bar, which has these hash marks, if you can see that, are men who are interested in joining a fraternity but did not. And the last bars here, the solid gray bars, are men who were not interested and therefore did not join a fraternity. So what I'm going to do first is actually talk about rape myths, and we'll talk about rape myths for fraternity men compared to those who did not join a fraternity. In general, as you can see here indicated here, fraternity men scored higher than non-fraternity men on 3 out of the 5 rape myth subscales. And this included, it was not rape, he did not mean to, and she lied, which was marginally higher for fraternity men. Next, I'll turn to rape proclivity or proclivity to perpetrate, where fraternity members scored marginally higher than non-members on proclivity to perpetrate by force, but not proclivity to perpetrate by intoxication. And finally, in terms of the results that I'm going to present, we looked at time in the fraternity and the outcomes. And time in the fraternity was not a significant predictor of any of the outcomes, meaning that men who joined a fraternity did not increase endorsement of rape myths compared to those who did not join over the first year of college. And actually, this was the same for rape proclivity as well, where men who joined a fraternity did not increase proclivity to perpetrate compared to men who did not join. So there was no significant interaction between fraternity membership and time. So finally, I'm going to move into a discussion. I have a brief discussion just to be in the interest of time. I have some additional discussion points that I'm happy to talk about on slides during the Q&A if people are interested. So mainly what I'll do is kind of summarize some of the findings here. Participation in fraternities did not seem to incubate rape myths or rape proclivity over time. And this is contrary to previous studies in this area, and indicates that men who joined fraternities already had these beliefs. They had them coming into the fraternities. Additionally, fraternity members had significantly higher scores on 2 out of the rape myths and additional marginal higher scores on an additional 1 subscale. And finally, men who joined fraternities scored higher than men who did not on rape proclivity by force, but not rape proclivity by intoxication. And I have here my contact. I'm happy to put it in the chat as well as a full citation for the article. Happy to share that as well for anybody who is interested. Additionally, I have multiple references here. Again, happy to share those for people who are interested. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening to me today. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So now we will move on to the next presenter, please.
All right, let me see if I can do this properly. Great. I assume everybody can see it.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Thank you. So I'm Dr. Annabelle Frazier, and I'd like to share with you some findings that we had from a study of the rape myth acceptance scale and its utility in predicting sexual and interpersonal violence. So in recent years, victims' empowerment movements and several well-publicized cases produced increased attention to sexual assault on college campuses. Along with that scrutiny of university policies and responses to sexual misconduct, there's been a lot of attention on sexual assault and harassment prevention on college campuses. So traditionally, preventative interventions have consisted of didactic and web-based awareness raising trainings, and sort of the trainings that talk about consent and its relation to sexual violence. These trainings have been largely ineffective. More recently, interventions targeting bystanders have gained some popularity. These interventions train people who might witness a potential assault to intervene in some way. Although some of these have shown some promise, they've also been criticized because they put the onus of sexual assault prevention on people who are not involved in the assault, rather than putting it on the would-be perpetrators. But there have been some primary prevention efforts as well. In most of these efforts, rape myth acceptance has been used as a measure of assault likelihood and preventative efficacy. In many of these evaluations, change in RMA was the only included predictor. So in our study, we wanted to test the predictive value of multiple sexual aggression predictors, comparing these to the Illinois rape myth acceptance scale to evaluate their impact when included simultaneously into 3 multivariate models predicting young men's self-reported sexual aggression, exploitation, and stalking acts. Data for this study included 396 US males at ages 18 to 26. They were recruited through MTurk for a larger project on psychopathic traits and sexual assault. 92 participants' data was excluded due to missingness, so the final sample for the study was 304 participants. In the final sample, the majority of participants identified as white heterosexual males. Participants completed multiple measures to evaluate the relevant outcomes and predictors for the study. Here you can see their mean scores in each of the study's measures. Intermixed with the criminal history items we gave them, participants were asked to report on 3 items measuring sexual aggression, sexual exploitation, and stalking behavior. So you can see the questions at the top. Our analysis included 3 logistic regression model pairs that were compared. So the IRMAS only model and the comprehensive model. In model 1, we used the IRMAS scores and some demographic controls, and we compared that to the comprehensive model that included the same demographics, IRMAS scores, as well as some scores in these other predictors of interest that we describe. The 2 models were compared, and the best fitting model based on LRT, AIC, and BIC values was selected. So 17 participants, or 5.6%, endorsed having pressured or forced someone to have sex. In the IRMAS model, you can see that the IRMAS was indeed significant in predicting the likelihood of that self-report. But in the comprehensive model, it was no longer significant. Instead, other predictors like criminal history, empathy problems became significant in that prediction. The comparison indicated that the comprehensive model was better at covering the data, which means that ultimately the IRMAS is not predictive of sexual aggression when other predictors are included. In sexual exploitation, 19 participants, or 6.3%, endorsed having sex with someone who was intoxicated, asleep, or passed out. Again, we see the same pattern here. When IRMAS is the only predictor included, it is significant. As soon as we enter into the comprehensive model, the IRMAS becomes non-significant, and other predictors, namely criminal history in this case, become significant. The AIC and BIC, as well as the LRT, indicate that that model is a better model. So again, the IRMAS is not predictive of sexual exploitation acts when other predictors are included. Finally, again, 6.3% participants reported that they followed or watched someone without their knowledge. We see the same pattern as the other 2 models, with multiple significant predictors emerging in the comprehensive model. So in this study, our concerns about the predictive value of rape myth beliefs were substantiated across the 3 model comparisons. That is, rape myth acceptance was significantly the weakly predictive of actual behavior that participants reported. But once other predictors were included in the comprehensive model, that relation went away, while other significant effects emerged and resulted in a more comprehensive overall prediction of the likelihood of that misconduct. Participants' reports of other non-sexual criminal history were consistently predictive of increased likelihood of reporting sexual and intimate misconduct, supporting the premise that sexual and partner violence may be interpreted as part of a general antisocial pattern, at least for these college-age men. Likewise, these results may indicate that young men's rape-supporting beliefs are not necessarily predictive of their sexual misconduct. So think of Ariely and Lowenstein's work on hot states. What we say we are going to do is not necessarily what we're actually going to do in a hot state. Another interesting point here is the several significant effects of emotional and behavioral functioning measures that were included. As other research suggested, young men who reported problems in their ability to relate to others' suffering or put themselves in others' shoes were also more likely to victimize other people. Likewise, higher aggression scores overall predicted increased likelihood of stalking, consistent with prior research. Importantly, unlike criminal history, these predictors could be used as targets for prevention programming as alternatives to interventions targeting rape myths. So several observations in this study can have a direct transformative impact on sex crime prevention strategies on college campuses. Specifically, the rape myth acceptance doesn't seem very effective in predicting these crimes. So that might bolster arguments for using other more direct measures of risk and behavior, as well as predictors of behavior change following interventions. Those might include measures of prior criminal behavior to identify students whose need is the highest, along with measurement of traits that are amenable to intervention, like empathy building or aggression reduction. In addition, given the difference in significant predictors between the three outcomes of the study, programming should consider different behavioral and personal characteristics might influence or contribute to the occurrence of these forms of aggression. So they may need to be targeted differently. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to reach out. My information is on the slide. I'm happy to share the paper that this presentation is based on and discuss it further, and I'll leave questions to the end.
Perfect, thank you. And last but not least.
Okay. We can see?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. All right, my name is Dr. Joseph E. Gonzales. I'm working with my colleague, Melissa Pope, who is here today. She's a doctoral student who's working with me at University of Massachusetts Lowell in our PhD program. Today I'm talking about the unchecked assumption of measurement invariance in the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale. And so luckily my co-presenters have already talked about the IRMA quite a bit, so I don't have to go and beleaguer the issue of what the IRMA is per se, and I can focus on the problem of latent constructs and their measurement. And so of course, latent constructs are just a way to describe a variable that we can't measure directly, right? And we have lots of these, okay? We can talk about affect or love, romantic attachment, or even propensity toward violence, right? These are all things that are hard to measure directly, either because the behaviors are very covert or not well defined, or maybe can be expressed in a multitude of ways. And so what we try to do is we try to go and find some indicators that we can use to indirectly assess and then infer the presence of these types of variables. And so of course, when you look at the rape myth acceptance scale and other variations of rape myths, we see a latent construct. We see a construct that is not readily measured directly per se, but is instead assessed using a cascade of indicators, depending on the scale you're using. Okay, and so of course this then leads us to the problem of measurement fidelity or reliability, as we refer to it often. This is that notion that when we measure something, we can be consistent from one time to another using our measurement tool. It's an essential precursor to establishing things like validity, which is critical in latent variable modeling and latent constructs. And it's just because we don't necessarily know that we're measuring the thing we intend to measure because we can't measure it directly. We have to infer it. And once you get into that space of inference of a construct or inference of a thing, it becomes very hard to define how we measure something. We're used to very consistent measurement tools, for example, when we talk about length or time, weight, temperature. These are tools that have some error in and of themselves, sure, but they are very consistent and it's very easy for us to go and test them for validity. It is much harder when we start to talk about something like a latent construct. Okay, and this is why it's very important from one study to the next. We will typically go and evaluate the reliability, at least, of these constructs before conducting our analyses, etc., which of course all my co-collaborators did. They just, for the sake of argument, tried to skip that part because it's kind of the boring part. So of course, because it's the boring part, that's where I live and that's what I want to talk about. Okay, and so typically what we'll do is we'll do some kind of reliability testing. Cronbach alpha or coefficient alpha is the most ubiquitous of these attempts to establish reliability. Omega is also sometimes used, increasingly so, largely because Cronbach's alpha is heavily criticized as having a lot of potential problems in terms of establishing true reliability. Internal consistency, maybe, but true reliability, that's another story. And so very often when we talk about a latent construct, we're actually going to be talking about something called measurement invariance. And this is rarely done, which is of course why I get to keep talking about it, right? Until it becomes a dead horse and everyone's doing it and I'll have to find something new to talk about. And so the idea of measurement invariance is it's essentially the quality such that the covariance and mean structures of our latent indicators, all those variables that we measure to infer our latent construct, it's that quality that over time or between groups of participants, they are going to be the same. They will be invariant. They won't change. And it's a very important thing to do to establish the measurement invariance, because that is how we can be confident that the nature of the latent construct we are inferring from one group to another or over time is consistent, is functioning in the same way. In other words, that we are measuring in the same way from one time to another, right? So imagine, for example, if I had a ruler and I went to go and measure one person's arm with that ruler, and the ruler was a certain size, and then I go to measure another person's arm, and that ruler perhaps doubles in size. Well, obviously it's not reliable, it's not consistent. That is essentially what we're trying to show with measurement invariance. We're trying to show the conditions such that the tool itself is not changing across the conditions of its use, right? And this is very important for several reasons. Some of it having to do with the problems of having these complex multiple indicator measurement tools, and some of it having to do with the problem of whether the tool is functioning consistently. So for example, let me go and talk about two types of biases that we can easily see. We have one situation where we imagine that we have a latent construct. We'll just call it X because I'm very bored. And X is indicated by several indicators, let's say 6 of them. And then we have some outcome of interest Y, okay? You can tell I teach statistics. And we can see that X is not actually related to Y. Our latent construct has no actual relation to our outcome of interest. But when we have latent constructs, we have residuals. We have parts of the indicators that are not actually related to the latent variable. They're different from it. They're separate from it, okay? And what can happen is these residuals could have a relation with our outcome of interest, okay? They could have a residual specific relation. We call this a nuisance association because we don't care about this. What we care about is X, the latent construct. In this situation, it's very easy, because we tend to work with composite scores or sum scores, to have a confound where this meaningless association is now a part of X when we calculate it, and then we will have a small but potentially significant association now found in Y. And that's a potential confound. This can happen when we use things like coefficient alpha, omega, when we use composite scores or sum scores, and when we're not sensitive to these types of factors. Okay, so we could also have a situation where the mean differences can be meaningful. So here we have a situation where we have, again, our latent construct X, okay, but we have it on under two conditions. We have group 1 and group 2. And what we can see here is that the mean value of X is 0. And that just means it's standardized and it doesn't have any kind of metric of interest to us yet. But we can see that for groups 1 and 2, the mean of X is the same. It does not change. And yet, if we look down here, the residual means, specific means, are in fact, for some of these variables, different. Again, if we use composite scores, when we go and aggregate these together, those mean differences that are specific to the latent construct, to the residual, can be confounded now with the latent construct, and we might detect a mean difference between these two groups when in fact there is none. So these are very problematic things that we miss and fail to take control for when we don't test for measurement invariance. And it just flows through research without us ever detecting it. Okay? So what we were interested in because of the strong influence of Melissa and her research interests. I'm obviously a numbers person. We were interested in the IRMA, the Illinois Rate Method Acceptance Scale, and the fact that there's very little research that really kind of reaffirms or reconfirms the actual measurement structure. And more importantly, that there's been very little work actually looking at the tenability of measurement and variance. A lot of it's been cross-cultural. And then I found one longitudinal measurement and variance study so far. If you know of any, by the way, I'd love to know about them because my reference section needs work. Okay, so this has been a problem. We don't have much confidence in empirical literature. This is something that's established. And so we took a sample of 777 college students because it seems like a good population for this kind of question. That's where we see the IRMA being used a lot. And we had groups of men versus women, people who identified as white versus persons of color, people who were sexually active versus not, people who had been victims of sexual violence within the last year and those who had not. And we wanted to go and see if we could find measurement and variance between these different known groups for McMahon and Farmer's 2011 19 item updated IRMA scale. And we found that coefficient alpha for the overall scale was fantastic, 0.91, so we're good, okay? But when we test for measurement and variance, we find that partial weakened variance was established for two measures because we could not find weakened variance for those two, specifically when comparing for sexual activity and sexual violence history. And then more problematically, when we look at something like strong invariance, the criterion for mean comparisons, we found that none of these comparison groups demonstrated strong invariance. And in fact, we were able to establish partial strong invariance, but of course, without that control, this can be a serious problem for confounds. And so, what are the takeaways from this? Well, the takeaway from this is that neither weak nor strong invariance should be assumed in the IRMA. I would say this generally for any latent construct, but now we have empirical evidence suggesting that it's just not a tenable assumption within the data set as it's been looked at. We also see that we can establish partial invariance, which means we can still use this measure for research. Okay, we can still test meaningful hypotheses with it, but it means that we do have to be sensitive to when invariance is not observed, and we have to control for it in some way, just as we would in educational assessments when you have differential item functioning of an item. Okay, so of course the takeaway here is, everyone who wants to work with the IRMA, by all means, but you must then bring someone like myself along for the ride, or yourself start testing for measurement and variance. It's also important to recall that coefficient alpha said we were good to go. But clearly coefficient alpha is not capable of detecting these types of factors in these measurement tools. It's insufficient to do it, and if you look at the equation, you'll see why. So doing alpha is great, but it's not really sufficient to do anything. So while the primary project, we found that neither one more thing is we found that neither the one factor nor the second order factor solutions actually fit the data well in our sample. All right, with that said, I just want to say a quick thank you to all of our collaborators here for this presentation. Dr. O'Connor, Dr. Frazier, myself, and of course my student, Melissa Pope. And I think we're now ready for questions.
Yes, great. Thank you all. So I can ask questions as they come in through the Q&A. So attendees, feel free to ask.
And I know we had a question that I answered in text in the midst of the presentations regarding what hot states are.
Do you want to repeat the answer?
Yeah, just in case anybody's wondering. So Ariely and Lowenstein did a lot of work that I am a huge fan of on hot states, essentially testing whether behavioral intentions can equate to behavior. And the idea there was they tested whether when young men were aroused in an aroused state because they showed them some pornography or intoxicated or otherwise in an activated psychological state, whether they would be more inclined to engage in sexually aggressive behavior. And they found that indeed people were more inclined to behave in really inappropriate ways when they were in this hot state. And that was not matching with the intentions that they had described when they were in a neutral state. So I really love that research. I think it's fantastic. We should talk about it more. And that is why I bring it up whenever I present.
Awesome. So the next question is, what did you mean by proclivity? I think referring to the general panel title, and just generally for all of you, you could answer this if you feel comfortable.
Sure, I'm happy to go first, mostly because I went first in presenting. This is actually something I struggle with. I'm about to go on a tangent, but I will get back to your question. So I kind of struggle with, I'm really interested in intentions. So like, does somebody intend to perpetrate, but they do not? And that's not actually what these questions, at least in my study, and generally rape proclivity, doesn't usually actually measure that. It usually asks questions to participants that are something like, if you knew nobody would find out and you could never be caught, would you do X? And so in my study, it was, would you force somebody to have sex with you? And would you take advantage of somebody who was intoxicated, right? So they're very specific situations that don't exist in the real world. We don't have such assurances in the real world, right? That you'll never be caught and nobody would ever find out. So it's kind of getting at something, but it's not getting at an actual intention to do anything. So these types of measures have been used a lot. There are other ways of measuring it too, and I'm not sure what was used in some of the other studies, where instead of, usually we would ask about behaviors that were done to perpetrate a sexual assault. Have you ever, and then it would describe a behavior, and that would be used to measure perpetration. You could also kind of phrase those as, how likely would you be to ever do any of these behaviors? And then it would ask a behavior that meets the definition of sexual assault without saying sexually assault somebody. So I think those measures are much preferable to what was used in my study. I'm going to be very transparent about some of the weaknesses. I didn't design the study, but what I used is actually frequently used. So I don't know if other panelists have other thoughts, or maybe can answer the question more directly than I just tried to.
Yeah, I think that the definition is right. Proclivity is really all about intent. Whereas, so for us, we asked people, did you ever do X, Y, or Z? So our study actually measured people's self-report in saying, yes, I did this. I had sex with someone who was passed out. And that goes to proclivity, because if you had committed the thing, then you probably might be more likely to say, if nobody caught me, I might do it again.
Yeah, so for me, when I think about proclivity, I think that my major issue, especially when I look at measures like this, is, of course, we're trying to measure something indirectly, and then we're trying to measure it indirectly again, right? So we're multiple degrees of removal from the thing we actually are trying to measure. And so the first problem of removal is, of course, we can't ask people these questions directly because we assume that most people won't answer them directly, which is fair, right? But then on top of that, we're trying to talk about a construct as a proxy for the thing we want to measure directly that itself is now a function of multiple other indicators. And so as we start to get further and further degrees of removal from our target outcome of interest, I think it becomes increasingly difficult. And I think that for me, my major concern with these things when we talk about proclivity is the problem of validity, which of course Dr. Frazier's presentation kind of touches on in an important way, I think. Although certainly O'Connor's also touches on this same idea of, can we go and use this to make these predictions or outcomes? And of course, do we see some associations with these things? And so for me, when I talk about this idea of proclivity, I think that there does seem to be evidence that this is a useful measure and that it has some kind of utility at times, but it's also inconsistently so. And it isn't always tied directly to the outcomes of actual interest, for example, as Dr. Frazier showed. And so for me, when I talk about proclivity, and I think about this proclivity thing, I think of it more as this degrees of removal from the thing we're actually interested in, as opposed to a direct assessment of any kind of statement of intent of doing anything. Although, again, Dr. O'Connor had an actual measure that was intent to commit this problematic behavior.
Great, thank you. There was another question. Okay, you answered it. All right, about invariance. Would you like to say anything else about that, or?
I can repeat it if there's no other questions at the moment. So when we talk about the role of measurement and variance in planning a study or conducting a study, as I indicated, I think there's really two key places where it lives. The first is in terms of course, planning your study, because to conduct measurement and variance testing, you need a certain amount of data density just to do that. That is its own type of analysis. And so that then becomes an issue in terms of power planning for your sample size. Okay, so you should be thinking about that as you design the study itself and do some analyses there. It can be difficult to do, but there you go. You also then need to go and conduct these measurement and variance tests before you actually conduct any other types of statistical analyses of interest. So before you go and evaluate whether or not there's mean group differences between these some known groups, it would be useful to test for measurement and variance and establish whether or not you have differential item functioning of some of the items, so that you can control for that, to then conduct your test so that you don't have any kind of bias. The same is true to some degree for obviously the regression models. And then of course, in the background of all this, as a numbers type person, as a quantitative psychologist, I'm a huge fan of SEM, structural equation modeling. So of course, my immediate motivation is really just to get you all to move into that framework so that we can just start modeling these things as linear constructs, so that we can try to control for those situations where you might have confounds from nuisance associations that are not of interest to you, but that might be there nonetheless, and you don't want to have that confound your target hypotheses. Okay, so those are the two places where I would say it's worth looking at and controlling for. As a final note of interest, when you talk about something like coefficient alpha, omega, and you use a composite score or sum score, it's not always a problem. Sometimes it's perfectly fine. The problem is that those types of, especially coefficient alpha, it assumes that all of the items are going to be weighted the same. It assumes that all of the items are going to function the same. And it assumes that you have no other additional associations that are going to be problematic. And so this is a way to test that explicitly, as opposed to assuming it, which more often than not, in my experience, is not going to be true.
All right, so we have one more question. It was said that because people might not want to answer these study questions, the results of these studies can't be used to make a statement per se. What percentage of the population is needed to make an accurate claim based upon the findings in these studies?
I think that's really a question to Dr. Gonzales. That's going to be really tough to answer.
Yeah, so I'll try to, because there's two there that look like they're to me a little bit. So, Chandler, my comment about what proportion of the population you're going to need, that's a power analysis question, really, right? So what we have to figure out is what proportion of people are going to even respond to these types of questions. And then what's our ability to actually then use that as in some other model. So this becomes a power analysis type problem. But at the heart of that also is, what percentage of the population need to make an accurate claim? It's hard to say, because at the same time, to the extent that these measures just might not represent the thing we're really after, right? To the extent we might not have true validity, I would say there's no proportion of the population, right? If we can't establish true validity of these measures in a reasonable way, then there is no proportion that would be satisfactory, because you would be basing, the entire premise would be inaccurate. So that'd be my comment. But if we can establish some kind of validity, you could try to use this as a proxy. You could try to infer what proportion of missing data you actually have, things like that. Then you could maybe go and get a better estimate, right? Just like if we look at COVID right now, we can go and estimate what proportion of the population really has probably had it based off some of the missing data analysis we have. But of course, that's all premised on the validity or value of the current data. Angeli, is there a way to make the IRMA that can be reformed to make it more tenable, and therefore be more reliable? Potentially. Potentially. So for example, Melissa and I, we've been working on the idea of a gender neutral IRMA. Some other people have worked on this before. So one problem is that, when you present the IRMA in its current format, we're talking about only female victims and only male perpetrators. And that's just because that's typically the way this dynamic works out. But most male victims are the victims of male perpetrators as well. And so what's interesting about this is you have a couple of different things happening. First of all, you have males responding to the survey and they're reacting to the fact that they're being portrayed as the quote unquote bad guy. And that can cause bias in the way that men are responding, okay? The other problem is that you have men who might be victims, and that could also affect the way that they are responding to these types of scales. So one idea we've had is, what if we, make this gender neutral, for example, and try to remove those sources of bias? So that's one thing we could do that might help. We don't know for sure, though. Another problem that we have is when you look at these items, they're supposed to be subtle rape myths, but there's nothing subtle about them anymore for a lot of people. For some people, yes, don't get me wrong. You find a part of the population where they look at these problems, they say, absolutely. She was definitely asking for it. Oof, rough. But a lot of people can read this, especially college students. Okay, they are increasingly woke. So when you look at something like that, that is a potential source of bias as well. This is no longer necessarily functioning the way we wanted it to, where we're kind of picking up on these subtle cues. And then, of course, there's also the issue of how people want to conceptualize these behaviors, right? And of course, another idea that comes up, as Dr. Frazier and I have talked about, is the idea that we're making this is a rape myth, but there's another end of that spectrum when people are rating this. So are people just inclined to not want to endorse myths, period, and they just want to move away from it? But of course, there's an implied alternative at that other end of the spectrum that we're missing. So there's lots of problems with this. And there's no such thing as a perfect scale, and there never will be, because individuals are very different from each other and they respond to these stimuli very differently. But I think there are ways that we could potentially, if we understand our population of interest well enough, that we probably could remove certain aspects or modify certain aspects of these scales that would reduce the likelihood of this bias. But the moment you start to talk about individual groups, you start talking about individual differences, and those individual differences can be the source of these biases. So as long as you're interested in different types of subgroups within a population, there will probably always be a bias that you'll always have to try to control for. And it might not always be possible.
And I might add to that. So I think Dr. O'Connor's presentation and mine really highlight that there may not be a direct relationship between what we believe when we're asked about our beliefs and what we actually do when nobody's looking. So we may reform this measure to death, but I suspect that if it is true that our beliefs don't reflect what we do, that doesn't change the actual outcome.
And just to add on one more point, or maybe two more points. One is in my study, we actually tried to look at how these indicators then relate to perpetration of sexual assault, but unfortunately within our survey, we didn't have a high enough percentage of men affirming that they had perpetrated, even though we know that they probably had. So there's some real measurement problems with perpetration. That's like a different ball of wax that I will not get into, but I do think it's important. And then also going back to what Dr. Gonzales was talking about in terms of the work that you all are doing, which I'm really excited about. I've thought about trying to reform the scale for several years now, is also thinking about how heteronormative it is. So I have some research under review now that actually looked at perpetrators, male survivors of sexual assault and their perpetrators. And while the vast majority had a male perpetrator, if you break it down by sexual orientation, straight men generally had a female who perpetrated the sexual assault, whereas non-straight men had a male perpetrator. So there's some really interesting things going on in terms of sexual orientation and looking at how heteronormative kind of that scale is, and thinking about our samples. We often don't. We might narrow it down to just men, but do we look at whether they're straight men or not straight men that are in the samples? So it's really important to think about that as well. I'm really excited to hear about your all's work when you're done with it.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Oh, oops, we have another question. We only have a minute left of the panel, so I'm not sure if you can answer this in that time frame, but I'll direct you to the Q&A. I'm confused because when I heard the first two findings, it seemed like there are two different interpretations surrounding the effects of rape myth acceptance. Like one study suggests people who attend fraternities are more likely to perpetuate rape myth acceptance, while the other study indicates that rape myth acceptance does not have as much of a role in the second study. I hope I did not misunderstand the second study, but I want to get clarification surrounding rape myth acceptance in both studies.
So in my study, yes, there was rape myth acceptance generally was higher on 3 out of the, well, really 2, because one was marginal, 2 out of the 5 subscales, which are some of these more latent indicators that Dr. Gonzales was talking about, but not for the other one. So it was half of the rape myths were more likely to be endorsed by men who are in fraternities, as well as rape proclivity, about half as well.
And for us, the result was that when you considered other predictors, rape myths did not significantly predict any of the sexual aggression or exploitation items.
Okay, and with that, we are going to wrap up this panel. Thank you so much to the panelists for presenting your research. And if you're wanting to stay for the next panel, I'm going to close this one out and then restart it. So you can click again from the CrimCon website. And again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.